This paddock at Diggers Rest near Melbourne was the scene in 1910 of the first recorded flight in Australia. The pilot of the plane was the American escapologist Harry Houdini. He made 3 flights at an altitude of 100 feet, some of them lasting as long as 3.5 minutes.
Houdini had learned to fly in France and brought his Voisin biplane to Australia by ship. We can only speculate as to why the famous escapologist chose Australia to demonstrate his skill as a pilot. The plane was assembled at Diggers Rest, but Houdini had to wait until conditions were perfectly still before he made his flight. The Voisin had a pusher propeller and its elevators were in front, not behind the pilot. On March the 18th, 1910, Houdini lurched into the air, and on one of his flights, he flew as far as 3 kilometers.
Those flights established Victoria as the cradle of aviation in Australia, a fitting venue for the largest aviation event ever held in this country, the 1992 Australian International Air Show.
Avalon, Victoria, a huge airfield which itself has played an important role in Australian aviation, is the stage for the International Air Show. 250,000 people will attend the 5 days of the show, with 200 exhibitors from 14 countries. More than 300 aircraft are taking part, either in the flying display or as static exhibits. To start with, some basic aerial transport. A powered paraglider, where your legs become the undercarriage. And the aero chute, a 2-seat trike with a pusher propeller capable of 60 kilometers an hour, quite a bit faster than Harry Houdini. These ultralights are the popular drifters, and the men flying them are all instructors at Sunbury in Victoria. There are 3,000 ultralight pilots in Australia. It's a relatively inexpensive introduction to flying. Two perennial performers on the airshow circuit, the replica Fokker triplane and a very new replica Sopwith Pup. We'll probably never know whether it was an Australian gunner or a Canadian pilot who shot down the Red Baron. But in this flying display anyway, both the contestants live to fight another day. Some colourful training machines from the pre-war period, the Ryan STMs. This is an all-metal American aircraft with a fixed, spatted undercarriage. An elderly de Havilland, a Leopard Moth. Another view of the Ryan. A number of these aircraft were used by the Dutch in Java and came to Australia after the Japanese invaded. From de Havilland in Canada, the Chipmunk, used in quantity by the Royal Air Force and still in service. The Ryan again, and in the air it's easy to see the braced wings and the exposed cylinders. This one's painted in the trainer yellow paint at the US Army Air Corps. Another Ryan, this one in RAAF markings. This one's owned by Don Kendall of Kendall Airlines. Vintage aircraft like this have in recent years stolen the limelight from the fast jets, and it's easy to see why. Two de Havillands, the hornet moth and the puss moth, in formation. Both pre-war trainers, and both designed by a man who was also a keen entomologist. It looks old, but this is a more recent tail dragger, the Maul. It can take off and land like a STOL aircraft, and yet it's cheap to operate. About 5 minutes flying time from Avalon, the oldest military flying school in the world, Point Cook.
When you talk about aviation, the state of Victoria has a lot of firsts. Point Cook was the first flying training school in the Royal Australian Air Force, and they've been teaching people to fly here for 78 years. Sadly, all that will come to an end in December this year. But if you are visiting Point Cook, you must look at the museum, the most outstanding collection of military aircraft in Australia.
One of the oldest aircraft in the collection, a Morris Farman Shorthorn of 1912.
How much of the original aircraft did you have?
There's probably about 60–70% of the original aircraft we've got here. As you can see by the wooden interplane struts, a lot of these are the original, or most of them are the original struts. We stored them back here, original. The wings, a good percentage of the internal of the wings and the main plane alone are original.
Warrant Officer Dave Gardner is the curator at Point Cook.
Well, this aircraft here is a Supermarine Walrus. It was used by the RAAF in the Antarctica in 1948. We recovered it back here in 1980, and of course we've just put it in the jig here to start restoration on it. So people see that and they can't sort of picture what it looks like, but that's what the aircraft looks like.
Big pusher propeller and an amphibian, as you said. Another aircraft you'll see at the Point Cook Museum and nowhere else in Australia is this sole example of the McDonnell Douglas Phantom F4E, which served briefly with the Royal Australian Air Force between 1971 and 1973 while they were awaiting delivery of the F111s. This was a big, complex fighter which was still in service even in the Gulf War. In fact, some of them still are serving with the British forces. It was an extremely popular aircraft with the people who flew it, and this example has been given to the Point Cook Museum by the United States Air Force. And it's in very good condition too.
Number 1 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, was understandably reluctant to hand back its Phantoms to the Americans. They've only recently been retired from the Royal Air Force, and in the Gulf War, the electronics countermeasures variant was used in combat. Point Cook has a number of hangars open to the public. Prominent is the first prototype Australian Sabre, fitted with a Rolls-Royce Avon engine. Many people believe that this was the finest model of this American-designed jet fighter. There's an early helicopter too, a very rare Sikorsky S-51, designed by the Russian émigré Igor Sikorsky. Next to it, another early jet, the de Havilland Vampire. The beautiful silver biplane is the only Hawker Demon in the world. The RAAF used the Demon between the wars as a fighter bomber. The name Hawker is significant because it links one of the world's great test pilots with the first ever flight in Australia. The meeting of two remarkable men was here at Diggers Rest railway station.
When Harry Houdini made that first flight here at Diggers Rest in 1910, a number of aviation enthusiasts camped out here on the platform at Diggers Rest railway station to see him fly. Among them was a man who was destined to become one of the greatest test pilots of all time. He was born in Melbourne, and his name was Harold George Hawker. Hawker is one of the great pioneer aviators. He was partly responsible for the design of aircraft like this Sopwith Pup, and he was a motor racing driver in the great days at Brooklands. And yet, curiously, he's never really been feted in his native land.
He had enormous confidence in himself. I suppose the word cocky wouldn't be out of place to describe him. He really enjoyed the notoriety. He enjoyed being there and talking with all these people. He was never embarrassed. He was good at flying, and he knew he was good at flying.
After he saw Houdini fly, Hawker went to England. There he met Sir Thomas Sopwith, founder of the Sopwith Aeroplane Company and a pioneer flyer in his own right. Sopwith taught Harry to fly, but admitted later that the pupil became the master. In 1919, the Sopwith Company built this plane, the Atlantic, in an attempt to make the first non-stop flight across the Atlantic Ocean. The navigator, Kenneth Mackenzie Grieve, the pilot, Harry Hawker. Hawker's plane was designed to drop its wheels after takeoff to save weight. The idea was that it should land in England on hardened skids. Two-thirds of the way across the Atlantic, the engine overheated and Hawker ditched in mid-ocean. He was rescued by a Danish tramp steamer, but unfortunately the ship had no radio. In England, Hawker's wife awaited his arrival, unaware of the fact that he'd come down in the water. Finally, after a week, news came that Hawker had been saved. When he arrived back in London, the crowds went wild. His car was mobbed, so he escaped on a police horse. Hawker's daughter today lives in England. On the wall of her home in Surrey is the broken propeller of Harry's plane.
I imagine he was a very hypnotic sort of character on sheer enthusiasm, like anybody who has a tick about something, Mozart or Leonardo or somebody, you know, they have a tick about one thing and they must be an inspiration to other people.
A month later, the Atlantic was successfully flown by Alcock and Brown. They don't clap losers, but Hawker's unsuccessful Atlantic attempt was called a glorious failure. 2 years later, in this plane, not his own design, Hawker was dead, killed while rehearsing for an air race. And so today, Harry Hawker, one of Australia's most famous sons, is buried in England, not far from the factory which bore his name. The name Hawker also survives in famous aircraft like the Hawker Harrier and the Hawker Hurricane. But most people are completely unaware that Hawker was Australian.
Roulettes, approved.
Some more great Australian aviators, the Roulettes. This is the RAAF's premier aerobatic team based at East Sale in Victoria. The aircraft are a Swiss design, the Pilatus PC-9, built under licence by the Hawker de Havilland Company in Sydney. The RAAF has 67 PC-9s, each aircraft's worth $3 million apiece. classic aerial ballet isn't just for entertainment value. It provides valuable training for pilots. Each of the young men flying these aircraft are flying instructors, and pilots graduate from the PC-9 to fast jets, like the FA-18. There are 17 manoeuvres in a roulette show, ranging from the snake loop to the delta loop and bomb burst. The PC-9's about the same size as the Mustang of World War II, and it's almost as fast. The Pratt & Whitney PT-6A turboprop drags it along at 570 kilometres an hour. And although this is a propeller aircraft, it's fitted with an ejection seat. But important though this aircraft is as a training machine, the crowd at Avalon have come to see it fly, something it does extremely well. And this, a mirror flying sequence in which one aircraft flies inverted above another, just a few meters apart. The view from below or above, depending upon your point of view. And the finale piece, a bomb burst over the heads of the crowd.
Roulettes remounted, very nicely done, thanks a lot.
Those of you who remember our coverage of the Richmond Air Show in New South Wales exactly 12 months ago may remember this aircraft because we filmed it when it was being assembled. It's a BAC Strikemaster, formerly of the Singapore Air Force, and it's a testimony to the growing number of warbirds on the Australian Civil Register. There are now something like 100 privately owned former military aircraft flying in Australia. This one's quite a fast little number. It's been beautifully restored and it's for sale.
This was the scene at Winry Aviation in Sydney when the aircraft was being reassembled and restored. The Strikemaster is a development of the British Jet Provost Mark V. Originally it was a trainer, but armed versions carrying machine guns, rockets and even bombs were supplied to a number of air forces, including Sri Lanka, Kuwait, Sudan and of course Singapore. The pilot and instructor share a roomy cockpit sitting side by side. Winry have a well-deserved reputation for the restoration of warbirds, and this is a very fast aircraft capable of more than 350 knots. "12 mighty cylinders and the registration VHBOB identify this aircraft as the Mustang owned by Bob Eastgate of Melbourne. There are 3 airworthy Mustangs in Australia. Other Australian-built Mustangs are flying in the United States. This was the long-range fighter par excellence, used by Australia in Korea. Highly manoeuvrable and still to many people the best fighter plane of World War II. Its name means eagle in Aboriginal. It's the Winjeel, or more precisely, 6 Winjeels. This is a wholly Australian-designed and built aircraft which was used to train pilots in forward air control techniques, which meant flying over enemy positions and marking the targets with smoke. The Winjeel's no longer in service with the RAAF, but there are more than a dozen in private hands. Its 450 horsepower Pratt & Whitney Junior Wasp engine gives it more than enough power to perform a full aerobatic routine, including a classic fighter peel-off. Another classic fighter tucking up its wheels. Always a welcome sight at any air show, the Supermarine Spitfire owned by Colpay of Scone, New South Wales. This is the only airworthy Spitfire in Australia, although there are at least 4 others being restored to fly. Even if you don't know the name of any other aeroplane, you've probably heard of the Spitfire. It's a lovely, graceful machine which looked right and flew right. Its engine, the V12 Rolls-Royce Merlin of 1,700 horsepower. Australia had more than 650 Spitfires in World War II, Mark 8s like Colpays or Mark 5s like these aircraft, filmed at RAAF Laverton in 1943. These machines have the Vokes filter under the chin, which was designed for dusty conditions, but later discarded. Spitfires were awkward to land on a runway, but worse on an aircraft carrier, a job for which they were not designed. This rare film is of Australian pilots flying Seafires of the British Royal Navy. This aircraft went over the side, but the pilot miraculously escaped. Seafires had folding wings, so they could be easily stowed below decks. The only other addition was an arrestor hook, which occasionally caught the wire. The unmistakable sound of the North American Harvard. This is an aircraft which never saw service with the RAAF, although 11 are now flying in Australia. An astonishing total of 17,000 Harvards, Texans or SNJs were built. The plane first flew in 1935, and most of those now in Australia came from New Zealand, where the Harvard was used as a basic trainer. The Harvard was and is fully aerobatic. Basic it might have been, but some versions carried guns and bombs. Although it first flew before World War II, it served in both Korea and Vietnam. The saying goes that to learn how to fly the Spitfire, first get yourself a Harvard. It sounds great, and it's fully aerobatic. But the Warbird movement isn't solely a male domain. Judy Pei flies the T-28 and Liz Apps the Chinese Nanchang.
You've been flying what? What was your first mount? Your first Warbird aircraft that you flew?
Alan's Harvard. My ex-husband has a Harvard.
Yeah.
I guess that was the first one. Before that we were flying Tiger Moths and more antique type of aircraft. And the Harvard was next, and then Alan and I saw these at Oshkosh and bought one and brought it back about 5 years ago.
It's a sort of what you might call an affordable Warbird, isn't it? It's
reasonably, yes.
Yeah.
The fuel flow's pretty high. It's about 200 litres an hour. But, and the oil flow, as you can see, is bleeding to death. But yeah, it's reasonably affordable compared with something like a Corsair or a Spitfire or something. Yeah.
Most people would say, you know, aren't women supposed to fly nice little cozy little Cessnas
Yes.
and things like this? This is a pretty hairy-chested aircraft, isn't it?
It looks it, but it's quite nice to fly. Liz has been in the aircraft with me when we're coming back from Alice Springs, going down to Unadata, and it's light and lovely, isn't it?
It's lovely.
Yeah.
But they all are. The Warbirds are designed for fairly untrained pilots to fly.
I think so.
Yeah, so they are easier to fly than people imagine.
You've been flying the Nanchang, of course.
Yes, only from the back seat so far.
What's that like?
Beautiful. Very light, very easy to fly. The only problem is taxiing it because the hydraulic braking system makes it a bit exciting. You tend to have cheering crowds when a novice gets in to watch you go in circles on the runway.
So are you the only two
women warbird pilots, as far as you know, in Australia?
In Australia, as far as I know. Yes.
Really?
I think so. I don't think anybody else
I
flies.
can't think of one. But
I can't. No, I can't think of anyone else. But I don't know. It's not. It's probably through lack of opportunity rather than anything
Yes.
else, because I mean, nobody will really lend you a warbird to go and practice on. But as Liz says, they're not that difficult.
They're not
to fly.
quite so forbidding as they might look.
No. Just cost-wise, it's forbidding.
Just tell me a little bit about your vampires. How are they coming along?
We've got one which should have flown by now, but hopefully we're going to transport it next week after Avalon's over, and it'll go to Laverton, and it should fly very shortly.
So that'll be the second vampire flying in Australia, won't it? We've only got one flying.
Yeah, we've only got one at the moment. And, so the second. After that, we'll have to put together a single seater.
So moving on to jets. You're moving on to jets,
Yeah.
obviously. That should be a bit of fun.
Yes, I know.
Your first jet?
Yes, I haven't flown jets before.
It's a side by side, is it?
The one we're building is a side-by-side, yes, the trainer. So we thought we'd better build a two-seater to start with and all learn how to fly it. We'll build a single-seat fighter version after that.
Right.
Because it was something I was sort of interested in, just fly a single-seat fighter jet aircraft. So one day we'll get there.
Why do you think it's important that we should preserve particularly warplanes of this vintage?
well, I think partly that the post-war era tends to be overlooked. It's neglected, and I think by the time people get around to wanting to preserve it, the planes won't be there. So I think we have to look at Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Borneo, and start looking after our heritage there now.
When Humphrey Bogart told Ingrid Bergman to catch the plane with Laszlo, he meant get into one of these, the Lockheed 10A. But the Lockheed wasn't just the star of Casablanca. It was the plane which took Neville Chamberlain to Munich, and in front of which he waved a piece of paper. This is from an era when only the rich could afford to fly. It's an ex-Ansett plane from the 1930s, and it survived 3 crashes and 28 forced landings before being rebuilt by Laurie Ogle, a Sydney businessman. Same vintage, different manufacturer. The Douglas DC-3, C-47, Dakota, Goonie Bird, Biscuit Bomber, or Puff the Magic Dragon. The Dakota first flew in 1933, and there are 500 left still flying throughout the world. People who make planes are still trying to come up with something as good. Even in the 21st century, there'll still be DC-3s. Unfolding its wings for the crowd, the mighty Sea Fury. This aircraft's owned by the well-known Italian flyer Guido Zuccoli. It once saw service with the Iraqi Air Force and is popularly known as the Baghdad Fury. The Royal Australian Navy used the Sea Fury in the 1950s. It's one of the fastest propeller-driven fighter aircraft ever built. Under the cowling, an enormous engine of 2,550 horsepower. But even though this is a piston-engined aircraft, it flew against MiGs in Korea and succeeded in shooting one down. Not the real thing, but a good replica of a World War II German aircraft, the Fiesler Storch. This machine has an astonishing short takeoff performance. Even in replica form, it can fly at 30 kilometers an hour and land in 12 meters.
Just tell me the story of how you built this aircraft.
Actually, it started off with a radio control model that I had.
A model?
That's right. And,
so you had no plans for the aircraft?
No, not at all.
But you had plans for a model plane?
Exactly. And which is available in the model shops, and I just styled it all up, and there it is.
So you just got your slide rule out and sort of made it what? Made it bigger?
Approximately it's about 3/4 scale.
In the Second World War, the famous German pilot Hanno Reich flew a Storch into the center of Berlin and landed it on a public road. Her aim, to rescue Hitler from his bunker. Hitler declined, and the rest is history. But 50 years later on, no one's yet come up with anything that can land and take off almost like a helicopter. Nestor Slepchev took 3.5 days to fly this plane from Port Macquarie to Avalon. A great many trucks saw him in their rear-view mirrors. It's not difficult to see why it took him so long. Another big Lockheed twin, the Lockheed Lodestar. Dating from World War II, it was used as a transport and flown by just one RAAF squadron, number 37. Some survived the war. This one was being used as a chicken coop before it was restored to fly again, hence the name. From the same manufacturer, the Lockheed Ventura. This aircraft served with the Royal Canadian Air Force, but has been repainted in RAAF colours of three-tone camouflage. The engines, two 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitneys.
Just tell me a little about the role of the Ventura in World War II.
The Ventura was used as initially as a light bomber, and then it was eventually put into a maritime strike aeroplane and also maritime reconnaissance.
And what's it like to fly?
It's rather fast, very powerful, and it gets very heavy on the controls.
What, on the ground and in the air?
In the air especially, the faster you go, the heavier it gets to fly.
Does it? And there's no power controls, of course?
No, it's all fly-by cable.
Fly-by biceps.
This machine was flown out from the States, crossing the Pacific in 38 hours. And that's a long way to fly without an autopilot. Another DC-3, this one in olive drab, is an ex-service machine now operated jointly by the Australian War Memorial and the RAAF. The engines in the DC-3, Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasps, exactly the same as the engine in a uniquely Australian fighter, the Boomerang.
It's a very important airplane, a very historic airplane for Australia because it was, as you know, designed and built originally in 16 weeks from pen to paper and flying. And there are a lot of people here that we have spoken to that worked at Fisherman's Bend, a lot of maintenance guys that looked after the airplanes. It was built in a time of need. They call it the panic fighter originally. It was built in a hurry. So it's a very historic airplane to the people of Australia.
A fighter powered by an engine from a DC-3. And these pictures show the wings being stress tested in Melbourne 50 years ago. The Boomerang was no great fighter. It couldn't get up high enough. Instead, it was used by Army Cooperation as a sort of flying bulldozer to cut a swathe through the kunai grass in New Guinea. This is the only genuine Boomerang flying anywhere in the world. And strangely, this chubby little plane was designed in Australia by a German Jew who escaped the Nazis.
When you're flying on a modern airliner, have you ever stopped to think where all the component parts of that plane are made? The button above your seat, for example, the flaps on the wing. Although Australia doesn't make complete aircraft anymore, we do make many components for other people's planes. And one of those centres of production is here in Melbourne, at Aerospace Technologies of Australia.
Much like most sport codes these days, aircraft manufacturers tend to think beyond national boundaries. Aircraft aren't really thought of as being American or European. In fact, companies like Boeing, Airbus and McDonnell Douglas now contract out about 50% of their work to specialist companies. And often, these aren't even on the same continent as the plane maker. You can't get much further away than Melbourne, yet Aerospace Technologies of Australia, or ASTA for short, has carved out a unique Melbourne-based operation supplying and maintaining all sorts of aerospace equipment right around the world. Things first started over 50 years ago in Port Melbourne, when in 1939 the aircraft construction branch of the Department of Supply was established to build Bristol Beaufort bombers. In 1946, the first Australian-built Avro Lincoln, successor to the legendary Lancaster, made its maiden flight from Fisherman's Bend. The years after the war saw the development of the Jindovic, a pilotless target aircraft. The Canberra Bomber and Dassault Mirage fighter program further cemented Australia's growing aerospace industry. A homegrown product, the twin turboprop general-purpose Nomad, had its first flight from Avalon in 1971. 170 Nomads have been built. The most recent project was the FA-18 Hornet multi-role fighter-bomber project. 73 of the Hornets were assembled locally, with some components still being manufactured here today. In 1987, Astor took over the management of the government aircraft factories, as well as expanding out here to Avalon. The Astor factory these days is making some interesting bits and pieces for a number of aircraft, such as these Airbus undercarriage doors, incorporating a complex double curvature design and comprising 23 square meters of this intricately honeycomb material. Astor also manufactures these Airbus underfloor structures, as well as the inboard Kruger flap for the Boeing 747. In fact, every Boeing 757 aircraft flying around the world today has an Australian-made rudder. 150 of these rudders have been delivered to the USA since work began in early 1990. Boeing's new baby, the 777, will be the world's largest twin-engined aircraft. Due to roll out in 1995, Astor is already well on the way and tooling up for the manufacture of the rudder of the 777. And we're talking large tools here, as the rudder will be one of the biggest single-piece carbon fibre aircraft components yet created. 12 metres long, or as long as this mould or lay-up mandrel used to form the left side of the rudder. Almost all the tools required for the 777 project are being designed and built here in Australia, a definite flow down of advanced technology and opportunity to Astor's many suppliers. Imagine booking in a Boeing 747 for a grease and oil change, even jacking it up so you change its tyres. But that's what customers like British Airways, Qantas and Continental do here at Astor's 747 modification and maintenance facilities at Avalon Airport. This barely recognisable all Nippon Airways 747, built in 1980 and having completed nearly 23,000 airframe hours, is booked in for a service. In 1987, the US Federal Aviation Agency ruled that 747s, up to and including some 300 series, after 20,000 flight cycles required mandatory modifications for all structural zones within what is known as Section 41. It includes such areas as the nose, flight deck and forward passenger compartment. It's a big job. In total, Section 41 work takes approximately 35,000 man-hours and grounds the plane for 7 weeks. While the plane is grounded, airlines often choose to have extra work done on their planes. This makes good use of the enforced downtime. With much concern these days about the safety aspects of aging aircraft, it's good to see an Australian company putting many more years of useful and safe service back into our jumbos. This Russian biplane looks as if it was made before World War II. In fact, it's only 3 years old, and if you're thinking of buying one, they're still being made. Barry Hempel took 2 weeks to fly it out from Poland.
Most people get the impression, I suppose, Barry, looking at this aircraft for the first time, they'd say that is a very old aeroplane. Surely the Russians aren't still making biplanes, but are they?
They are, and this is made under license by the Polish aircraft manufacturing company PZL, and they're still in current production now. Even though it is a biplane, quite a few people come up to me and say, oh, is this a copy of an old 1950? But it is in fact a fairly sophisticated aeroplane, and it has two wings because it does do a variety of roles. In America there's Cessnas, Pipers, but in Russia and Poland there's just literally hundreds of AN2s. And they're used in the military role. They carry guns, they carry about 20 troops, parachutists. They're used for agricultural work, they're used for carting executives around, and they're used for everything. And particularly good also for agricultural work and parachuting. But we intend to put them on floats and also skis, and be the first ski operator in Australia. And they're a remarkable aeroplane. They'll carry 14 people on board, around about 1,200 litres of fuel, or they'll carry, 3,000 or 4,000 pounds of freight.
And what's it like to fly?
It's sort of like a big tiger moth with 1,000 horsepower in front of you. It's got remarkable short field performance. At normal operating weights, it's quite light and nice to fly, but it's a sort of an airline type system. You've got to use a checklist. There's so many switches and things to operate. We're just gradually getting used to what every switch means and changing them into English.
I was going to say, most of the writing is in Polish. I suppose if you've flown an aircraft out 12,000 miles, by the time you get here, you know what every switch does.
Yeah.
The Antonov's the biggest biplane in the world, and although it looks ungainly on the ground, it's surprisingly manoeuvrable in the air. Later on, we'll see the Antonov's larger brother, one of the biggest planes in the world. But when he's not flying the Antonov, Barry's in his other plane, a MiG-15. Both these Soviet-designed MiG-15s were built under license in Poland. There are two others flying in Australia. This was a sight that Australian pilots in Korea would rather not have seen, at least not this close. Barry Hempel's flying the one aircraft in this loop. The second aircraft is flown by Errol Kavanagh, a Qantas jumbo captain. The MiG turned out to be embarrassingly good in Korea, although its Korean pilots were poorly trained. Today in Poland, you can buy one of these for the price of a new Holden. Running it and maintaining it, though, will cost you about $800 an hour. The biggest embarrassment of all about the MiG-15 is that it was powered by a British Rolls-Royce engine, a gift from the British Labour government in 1946. But back on the ground, Avalon was host to bigger things.
In the immortal words of Crocodile Dundee, that ain't a jumbo, this is a jumbo. This is the world's second largest aircraft, the Antonov 124. It weighs 400 tons. But would you believe it, the Russians make an even bigger aircraft with 6 engines.
Its Russian name is Ruslan or Condor. Like its namesake, it's a very big bird. This plane first flew in 1982, and although it was originally designed to carry heavy tanks and even ballistic missiles, it's now in demand as a commercial transport, lifting such things as transformers or propeller shafts for ocean liners, or even the equipment of rock bands. Nobody could accuse the Antonov of being a beautiful plane, but in the air it's nothing if not stately. It's surprisingly agile too, and what alarmed the organisers was how the display pilot threw this aircraft around, and for that matter, how close it got to the crowd. The Antonov is so big that the Wright brothers could have made their first flight inside it and still had enough room to land. And as a final party piece, the Antonov showed how it could land on just 4 of its 24 wheels. No problem, comrades. No problem at all.
Instructions. Thank you, Bob. Take the next taxiway right. Next taxiway right. Next taxiway right, Bob.
When the Antonov arrived at Avalon, it gave birth to 2 Soviet helicopters. The Mil-17 assault transport helicopter has been produced in huge numbers for the Soviet military, although this is a civilian version with a crew of 3 and seats for 24 passengers. The Commonwealth of Independent States is keen to sell its aircraft to the West. Aircraft like this Kamov Ka-32. Once again, this is a civilian version of an anti-submarine helicopter used by the Soviet Navy. The twin-rotor Kamov is surprisingly maneuverable, and this one is configured to carry stretcher cases and search and rescue equipment.
Another aircraft making its debut at Avalon is the Ilyushin 96. It's a 250-passenger airliner with a range of 11,000 kilometers.
Like Western jets, the 96 has winglets at the tips of its wings to improve fuel efficiency. We'll return to it later in the program. Another Ilyushin, the 76, now based in New Zealand and engaged in aid flights to Somalia. Russian aircraft are sturdy, practical and well made, although sometimes the interior fittings leave much to be desired. Western operators are now looking to acquire them cheaply and retrofit them with more sophisticated equipment. On this aircraft, the navigator sits downstairs under the pilot, and the rear of the plane has big clamshell doors to handle large stores. It might look like the inside of a supermarket, but this is the Lockheed Galaxy, slightly smaller than the Russian Antonov, but still tipping the scales at 350 tons. The Americans call this aircraft the aluminum overcast. Back on the light side, it's aerobatic time again. Chris Baru in the Pitts Special, and the Beach Debonair, piloted by Warren Stewart. Pits in triplicate, the Sky Dancers, a Melbourne aerobatic team led by Newton Sambrook. The Sky Dancers have been together for 15 years. This breathtaking display of precision flying requires maximum concentration, and the pilots are regularly pulling -4 to +6 Gs. The Pitts Special, designed by Curtis Pitts, is a high-performance sporting biplane chosen by many of the Western world's finest aerobatic pilots. This aeroplane was produced both as a complete aircraft and in kit form. Many pilots still maintain it has no equal in the world of aerobatics. There are about 20 of these little aircraft in Australia and New Zealand. The man in the solo pits is probably the best-known name in aerobatic flying in Australia. Chris Barreau, 13 times Australian aerobatic champion, is from Adelaide. His father wanted him to be a fisherman. Instead, he ended up an outstanding pilot. Chris's flying display in the Pitts Special is usually contained above the heads of the crowd, but this year he's bringing it down to ground level. At 30 feet above the deck, he's going to cut a ribbon suspended between two poles. And as if that wasn't difficult enough, he's going to do it upside down.
I approached the runway at about, initially at about 100 feet, descend to about 30 feet, and then roll inverted. And as soon as I pick up the balloons, I roll inverted and target on those balloons. And that's all I see. I'm oblivious of everything else around me, because if you take your eyes off the balloon, it could be catastrophic. So I just target on those balloons and hit the balloons at about 180 knots.
This is the practice run. In a moment, he'll do it for real. But before that, something extra special. The German Extra 300 flown by David Loewe. David Loewe's only been flying competition aerobatics for 3 years, but he's already gone through 4 grades. The Extra consists of a very powerful engine in a very light airframe. The Extra uses its cleaner lines and advanced aerodynamics to do the same maneuvers much faster. Its greater speed means a corresponding increase in the G-forces dealt to its occupants. But these things can do tricks that will leave you gasping.
10 years ago, we did it in front of a CAA, or in those days I think it was DCA, examiner of airmen. And I came pretty close hitting the ground because it was new, and I tried to do it at low speed and tried to do it at different speeds and didn't know exactly where to look. And we filmed all that, but eventually we got it right to satisfy that particular person. But when he went back to head office, they said, oh, hey, we don't want stunt pilots in this country, and they canned it.
Chris Beru in the pits, 185 knots and 30 feet above the ground. If he misjudges, the results could be catastrophic. The balloons mark the target, and he's done it.
Avalon isn't simply a flying display. It's a major international trade fair that's attracted aerospace contractors and manufacturers from all over the world. All week there have been conventions and symposiums. Some good business has been done here.
Avalon was a shop window for plane makers. All the big names were here. More than 200 exhibitors from 14 countries put their wares on display. Exhibitions are for making business contacts, exchanging ideas, and promoting business activities. A number of important deals were struck here, including an order for computerized aircraft cabin equipment placed by the Russians with a firm from Melbourne. You've seen the model, now see the real thing. The Airbus A340. This aircraft had flown non-stop from Toulouse in France to Perth in 16.5 hours. In practice, it could have flown non-stop to Avalon, but only by using its 4 hours of reserve fuel. Airbuses are already in service with Ansett and Australian Airlines, but this model has 4 engines, not 2. The Airbus's main selling feature is that it's cheaper to run than a 400 series jumbo, although it's a smaller aircraft carrying around 300 passengers. At Avalon, the A340 demonstrated its ability to fly at a very high angle of attack. The A340 has no conventional control column, the plane being steered by a side stick controller.
Why we have a side stick instead of having big wheels is, first of all, as we have a fly-by-wire, it is not necessary to have very big wheel to send orders, electrical orders to computers. It is just necessary to have something which is still a good pilot interface, but which prevent to have the cockpit panel being obstructed by something which is a big wheel.
These are tough times for airlines. The appeal of this plane is its fuel efficiency.
At the end of the flight between Toulouse and Perth, our fuel consumption was as low as 4 tons per hour. So it means that each engine was burning 1 ton per hour. As compared to, say, 747-400, the normal fuel consumption in cruise is 10 tons per hour. in terms of direct operating costs, the A340 is really a leader.
International presence at Avalon isn't restricted to military aircraft. There are some fairly exotic executive jets here too. This is the latest version of a plane that's been around in one form or another for nearly 30 years. It's the 1000 version of the British Aerospace 125, and it'll set you back a cool $18 million. Let's have a look inside.
When expense is no object, the 125-1000 is the way to go. There are leather seats, a cocktail cabinet, polished wood fittings, a compact display, gold plate everywhere, even in the loo. In the same way as buying a car, you select the colour schemes and the interiors from the salesman's book.
Some go for the perhaps more polished interiors.
British Aerospace has sold 800 of these little corporate jets in 30 years. The 1000 version is longer, the engines are more powerful, and it can fly non-stop across the Atlantic.
And the cost in Australian dollars?
About $18 million.
I'll let you know, Jacques.
Delighted.
Just a little short.
But I
at the
think
moment.
you are interested, aren't you?
Well, I'll have to speak to my wife about it, but I think it might.
Yes,
be.
bring her along. Bring her along because we do find they're the best people for choosing the interior.
And so too the Ilyushin 96, which first flew 4 years ago. It's been accused of being a Russian copy of the Airbus, although the Soviets point out that it flew before the A340. The Russians are keen to sell this aircraft in the West, and a new version will be powered not by Russian Soloviev engines, but by American Pratt & Whitneys, which are more fuel efficient and have a longer life. The big Ilyushin will sell for less than its American and European rivals. Aeroflot, the Russian airline, is backing things both ways. They've ordered both the Ilyushin and the Airbus A310.
We have a very interesting design of chair. You see, I would like to invite my friend to take a seat. You see, if needs for him to go out and maybe to go anywhere, show how it's possible to do. You see?
So you can pull up that
Yes.
center seat and
You
let
see,
him out.
You're going to
that's
see no
good.
need to bother your neighbor. It is a very interesting thing.
Well, I've not seen
like, you see, these are seats made like in an old cinema. We make use many new technological process during design of this aircraft. This is a galley. You can see the two elevators because the main area of galley under the floor. I would like to invite you in our pilot cockpit. It is an absolutely new pilot cockpit for our Russian aircraft. It is so-called glass cockpit. It gives possibility to decrease the member's crew. In spite of I'm general designer, I try to play role as a you see, captain of this aircraft. You can see it's possible to fly, to start engines, and oh, sorry, just in front of us, the biggest aircraft, war cargo aircraft, Ruslan, Antonov designed, you see, Antonov IN-124. Sorry, it is impossible for us to make taking off here just now. But it will be possible, because I'm absolutely sure that we will be able to fly from Moscow, from Russia to Australia.
I guess it's easy to be disparaging about Russian aircraft. They make a sturdy machine, but some of the fittings inside tend to be a bit tatty, and they've never really been able to make a fuel-efficient engine. That's why the next version of this Aleutian will be fitted, believe it or not, with an American engine.
Well, our engine has a little more thrust than the Russian engine at the moment, so it will improve the gross weight, as Henry has told you, of the airplane for takeoff purposes. What it really does is it tends to help westernize the airplane, which we hope will make it more acceptable to the Western customer.
So is this the beginning of a long relationship, do you think, with...
It's absolutely a long-term relationship. We started this about 1989. It's on schedule. As Henry mentioned, we'll be at the Paris Air Show in '93. We've delivered our engines to the Aleutian Design Bureau, and they're being installed as we speak. The first one was installed about 2 weeks ago. All new pylons have been designed. Rockwell Collins Avionics is involved. In fact, there are 18 Western suppliers that are fitting the engines and the avionics to this 96M airplane.
A more familiar shape and a very familiar colour scheme. The Boeing 747-400 of Qantas. This very aircraft, long reach, broke all the records when it flew non-stop from London to Sydney in 20 hours. Qantas today operates the largest Boeing fleet outside the USA, both 747s and 767s. It's hard to believe that it's more than 22 years since the 747 first flew. Since 1970, around 1,200 have been sold around the world. This model carries 450 passengers. Qantas holds the record for carrying the most number of people in a jumbo. 674 people were evacuated in one aircraft after Cyclone Tracy hit Darwin. Since its merger with Australian Airlines on September the 14th, Qantas now has a fleet of 120 aircraft, ranging from little Cessna Titans to 747-400s. Avalon 92 saw several major parachuting demonstrations, the first by the Kiwi Blue team from New Zealand. And the precise placing of the New Zealand flag left the crowd in no doubt as to the origin of the species.
First-class professional parajumping here.
From the side of the plane, a parachuted side view of what it's like to fall several thousand feet. The Sport Parachuting Club, Sky Surf Australia, who hail from Melbourne, performed a 20-person formation jump, the first time a major airshow has seen such a display in Australia. Sport parachuting like this has grown steadily since its introduction in Australia in 1958. But it's only in the last 2 years that it's seen its most spectacular growth. Due to greatly increased media exposure, the sport grew 200% in 1991 to its current level of 62 clubs in Australia, representing over 13,000 parachutists. Hanging off the side of a Cessna is a very patriotic Dave Benson of Skydive Australia. A veteran of 1,500 jumps, Dave is in the record books as the performer of the largest parachuting flag jump in the world. That's over 1,300 square metres of flag underneath him. No prizes for guessing which country. Back to the Warbirds, the superbly restored Lockheed Neptune, now in its original midnight blue paint scheme. The Neptune preceded the Orion in service with the RAAF. This one's owned by Bob Delahunty of Sydney. Some models of this outstanding maritime aircraft were fitted with jets as well as piston engines. And here it's seen flying in formation with Australia's only flyable Grumman tracker. The trackers were deployed on the HMAS Melbourne. The last survivors were phased out in 1984, together with the carrier. For its day, the Neptune had an astonishing range of more than 3,500 nautical miles. The tracker, meanwhile, had the distinction of being the last propeller-driven fixed-winged aircraft operated by the Fleet Air Arm. Some more classic jets, starting with Australia's only airworthy Vampire. This distinctive twin-boom jet flew before the end of World War II, but unlike the Meteor, saw no combat. Parts of it, like other de Havilland products such as the Mosquito, are made of plywood. Today, Australia only has one Vampire still flying, but others are on the way. Air Commodore Ian Ashbrook is at the controls of this one.
Vampire overhead.
The black diamond on the side of this aircraft signifies the Black Diamond's aerobatic team of the mid-60s. This is the Commonwealth Sabre, an American aircraft modified by Australian engineers to take a British engine. "112 Avon Sabres were built between 1953 and 1961. The missiles under the wings are sidewinders. This version also carried cannon. This particular aircraft was presented to the Malaysian Air Force in 1969. It returned to Australia and was restored to flight in 1981.
That was a very early heat-seeking missile, and in fact we used to operate with them in Southeast Asia with the sidewinders.
Also powered by the Rolls-Royce Avon, the Canberra, probably the most successful jet bomber ever built. The Canberra was named after Australia's capital by Sir Robert Menzies. Affectionately, it was known as the Cranberry. There aren't too many still flying. This Australian-built one is now owned by Mr. Steve Picati of Idaho, who flew it across the Pacific to be at Avalon. These New Zealand pilots fly the A4 Skyhawk. It's an aircraft which first flew in 1954, although these planes were bought new in 1970 and have been progressively updated since then. On the ground, the Skyhawk needs a generator to start it.
Most people know how to start the family car. You simply put the gear shift into neutral and turn the key. But how do you start a modern jet fighter like this New Zealand Air Force A4 Skyhawk? Well, you need three basic components: air, sparks and fuel. Now, first off, to get the air, the ground crew attaches a large hose to the underside of the aircraft which puts compressed air to get the compressors turning. The pilot then takes hold of the throttle down here, waits till the revs come up to 5% RPM and moves the throttle from side to side to get the igniters working. That's the spark component of it. Then, when the RPM has moved up to 15% of power, he moves the throttle forward to give him some fuel. And that's basically about it. To move forward, of course, he advances the throttle, starts steering the aircraft and moves up onto the runway to take off. Simple, isn't it?
New Zealand has 20 Skyhawks, 6 of which are based at Nara. The Royal Australian Navy used to have Skyhawks too, and some people wish they still did. Today, the Kiwis are demonstrating how one aircraft can refuel another in flight using the buddy system. The aircraft in front carries fuel in the drop tank underneath and in the wings. Both planes are doing about 250 knots as they pass fuel to one another.
Kiwi, caution the left turn, the helicopter's at about 500 feet.
And this is a pilot's eye view of what it's like to refuel from another Skyhawk. The second aircraft's drunk enough, and it's time to wind in the hose.
A sophisticated aircraft like the FA-18 Hornet requires a lot of looking after. Australia's investment in these aircraft is $4.8 billion. So it's not surprising that a lot of work goes into prolonging their active life.
Literally down the road from Astor's Fisherman's Bend factory, the Aeronautical Research Laboratory, testing and researching aircraft and flight systems to reduce the cost and improve the safety of aviation in Australia. Established in 1939, the Aeronautical Research Laboratory, or ARL, was the original inventor of the black box flight recorder. They've also done pioneering work in developing an anti-submarine missile system and exploring the inherent weaknesses of the design of the F-111. We might wonder at the speed and maneuverability of modern combat aircraft such as the FA-18, but it does come at a price. Their ability to operate at very high angles of attack, the difference between the direction of motion and the direction the aircraft is pointing, produces buffeting and vibration on the airframe due to unstable airflow in certain areas. In this water tank experiment, with ink inserted into flowing water to simulate the high-speed airflow, we can see such buffeting happening in the tail region. This can seriously shorten the life of the aircraft, a phenomenon known as fatigue stress.
It has long been known, even before the days of such famous engineers as the German Wöhler, and before aeroplanes, that materials may break under repeated stresses which are very much lower than their ultimate strength. This property of materials, which for want of a better name is known as fatigue, is a potential hazard in most machines and structures.
Using more up-to-date equipment, the ARL is currently engaged in a project to determine the strength of the FA-18 when flying under Australian conditions. In conjunction with the RAAF, they've fitted strain gauges to critical parts of the aircraft and gathered lots of information about what exactly happens up there.
The project here is a collaborative one between the Australian Air Force and the Canadian Air Force. What we're trying to do here is extend the economic life of the aircraft. Because of the unusually high stresses involved in a fighter aircraft, extensive work needs to be done. This project here is going to be a world first because it's combining manoeuvre loading and flight loads simultaneously. We're going to vibrate the aircraft at the same time as we're applying air pressure to it. The test rig is essentially complete with all the loading actuators installed. We now have a brand new test specimen installed into the rig, which is going to allow us to continue testing of the rear fuselage and investigate the 6 aluminium frames that connect the fins to the fuselage. These are the areas that are of particular concern due to cracking during the life of the aircraft.
In the circuit, back at Avalon, a KC-135 tanker and 2 thirsty American F-15s. mighty fighters are normally based in Japan, but they'd been taking part in an exercise in Darwin. Both the pilots were veterans of the Gulf War.
You flew in combat with this aircraft?
Yes.
What was that like?
Yeah, did very well. Didn't lose a single airplane. Not a single C model Eagle got shot down by ground threat or an air threat.
What sort of roles were you doing? What was your role in Iraq?
Well, we were protecting strike packages. So we were escorting strike packages, and we were also tapping for the tankers and AWACS, protecting high-value assets on the Saudi Arabian side.
How good is the MiG-29?
Not as good as an Eagle.
What about the Su-27?
Not as good as an Eagle.
Have they ever met together in combat?
No, they haven't. MiG-29 has.
Yeah.
It lost.
It lost? Where was that?
Iraq.
Uh-huh. But I guess it would be, the pilot who's flying it, isn't it? I suppose you're...
Well, that always has a lot to do with the outcome of their engagement.
Yeah. But you're bound to say that your training is superior to theirs, I imagine.
We think so.
Also lurking in the Victorian skies, the unfamiliar shape of the Grumman Prowler. Its job, to jam enemy radar. That equipment is carried in the bulge above the tail. The Prowler can virtually destroy communications between attacking aircraft. And at $50 million a pop, it's one of the most expensive planes in the US Navy's inventory. It looks like a two-seater. In fact, it carries a crew of 4. Australia's frontline fighter, the FA-18, comes in for a low pass, simulating the firing of its 20mm cannon. A great crowd pleaser, the dump and burn of the F-111. Australia is to order another 18 surplus American F-111s to supplement the 24 now in service.
I guess it's stating the obvious that this is no normal day at Avalon, and one must have the greatest of respect for the air traffic controllers who are juggling these aircraft around, not just in the sky, but on the ground. So how best to get this sort of experience? Well, there's now a new air traffic control simulator that helps train air traffic controllers in this sort of work.
Air safety spreads out into all areas. The much greater air traffic densities in and out of airports, with less separation and higher aircraft speeds, means the responsibility on our air traffic controllers is ever increasing. Up-to-date training is essential. Like the now familiar flight simulators, control tower simulation would seem to provide convenient and safe schooling. While it was easy to replicate control tower activity beyond 5 miles with radar simulators, earlier methods to provide a type of visual simulation were rather basic. They relied on simple approaches such as slides and photographic panoramas with light spots for aircraft. Even large models of aerodromes were used, with model planes moved around by hand. ARL has come up with a definite improvement. The OS Tower project, located at the Sale Air Force Base, provides a full-scale replica tower, about which is projected the view of the aerodrome from 5 video projectors. Runways, taxiways, tarmacs, hangars and the surrounding countryside and airspace, even windsocks, provide for a most realistic and believable environment. And it's all done with computers. Up to 10 aircraft, helicopters or ground vehicles can be depicted in 3 dimensions simultaneously. They can perform all standard operational procedures such as taxiing, takeoff and landings, circuits and low-level flight. Surrogate pilots control the vehicles and communicate by radio with the control tower, waiting and acting on all instructions. Changes in weather conditions are easily depicted, from clear condition, foggy or the middle of the night. Emergency situations can be easily depicted, such as simulated crash conditions. All emergency procedures go into full action, vehicles rushing out to the scene as if it were all happening for real. With this computerized system, training on the job will become a thing of the past. Avalon 92 had flying machines of all shapes and sizes, from gyrocopters to big sophisticated military helicopters, like the Black Hawks of the Australian Army. The Army uses these big ground-hugging choppers for troop-carrying duties. The 2 pods on either side aren't weapons but external fuel tanks. The Black Hawks showed how they can insert troops behind enemy lines and back them up if necessary with heavy weapons.
The Australian International Air Show has well and truly put Melbourne on the map. This hasn't simply been just a flying display, it's been an international airfair which has attracted manufacturers from all over the world. It'll be some time, I dare say, before we see as many aircraft in the skies, and for that matter, as many people on the ground looking up at them. This is Jeff Watson at Avalon in Victoria.